Hey guys, how's it going? This is Jay once again with another review. And this time around, I'm going to give you guys my thoughts on Debian 10, codenamed Buster, which achieved stable status as of last weekend. So this distribution is fresh, and I'm going to give you guys my thoughts on that. But before I get into that, it's pretty obvious if you have seen my other videos that I'm in a different place. And the reason for that is I just recently started setting up my home office for recording. Now, I was using my friend Tom's studio for most of my videos, and I probably will continue to do that. He's a great guy and very generous, lets me go out there to his location and record, so I'm extremely appreciative of that. But I also want to be able to record from my home office as well. So if the video and audio quality isn't quite up to par with my previous videos, it's only because it's a work in progress and I'm still trying to figure everything out. It will get better, but I basically want to record sometimes over there at his studio and sometimes here in my home office. So you'll probably see a mix of videos from either location. So that out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at Debian 10. So here I am on my System 76 Lemur laptop. It's a bit older, but you know what? It works pretty well. It's about 3 years old, but I have no problems with it. It's a great machine for testing distributions and doing tutorials. So the screen you're seeing is from the laptop. I do not use virtual machines. This is installed on the actual hard drive, and this recording from the screen is actually coming straight off of the HDMI port. So here I am actually running the GNOME desktop. It's one of several different selections that you can choose between when you go and install this. Now I'll talk about the installation process in just a moment, but depending on which installer you use, you actually can choose to install multiple desktop environments. For example, GNOME is the default, but there's also KDE, Plasma. There's XFCE, Mate, and a number of others. So you can install any one of those or any combination you like, which is actually one of the things that I love about Debian is that there's no separate releases per desktop environment. There's live images that each one is dedicated to a different desktop environment, but they're all Debian. Unlike Ubuntu, where it's actually considered a completely different distribution when you go with a different desktop environment. For example, Xubuntu is XFCE, Kubuntu is for KDE, and so on. But with Debian, you can actually much easier combine multiple desktop environments. So I'll show you the others, but let's take a quick look around the GNOME desktop. And right away, you're going to see that we have a new theme. I'm not sure if you guys are going to be able to notice this. Now, recent versions of GNOME actually have a new theme. It's not, that different from the way it was before, but I think it does look better. It kind of grows on you. It's very simple, but Debian, they don't really customize anything outside of the wallpaper. So if you are the type of person that wants the desktop environment exactly the way the developers intended, with little to no changes, then Debian will be right up your alley, because this is the same theme that you'd see in Fedora or any other distribution that ships GNOME as its default desktop environment, the exception being the wallpaper, because they do actually go ahead and change that. There is a boot splash that shows up when you install this, and depending on the installer, you may not see the boot splash, but actually it looks really professional, and I do think it's awesome. It's probably the most professional boot splash that Debian has ever had. Now I want to talk a little bit about the installation process here, because there's some interesting quirks that I would like to make you guys aware of. First of all, generally speaking, you have two different options. You have a set of live installers. There's multiple, and each live installer has a specific desktop environment. There's one for GNOME, XFCE, KDE Plasma, Cinnamon, and others. So if you are installing Debian on a laptop or a desktop, that's generally what you're going to want to go with, because it's basically built and catered to the desktop experience. If you want to do either an advanced installation or maybe just a custom installation, or you're installing Debian on a server, you're going to want to use the net install, which is kind of like the old school way of installing Debian. If you've seen the net installer, several Debian releases ago, it's going to look exactly the same here. And what's noteworthy about that is at the very end or near the end of the installation process, you'll see a list of desktop environments, and you can select any one of them. You can select none of them. It's going to, by default, give you GNOME. But if you are installing on a server, you can deselect that because generally speaking, on a server, you don't want to have a desktop environment. But what you can also do is install multiple desktop environments. You could even install all of them if you wanted to, all the ones that are offered, and then select between them when you go and log into your system. So if you wanted to try multiple desktop environments, you're going to want to try the net install. Otherwise, if you already know what desktop environment you want to use in the case of a laptop or a desktop, then you would just download the live image that is based on that desktop environment. So you have an option of which direction you go with your Debian installation. So that's important for you guys to be aware of that. Now, I did notice a few interesting quirks about this, though. There's some inconsistencies between them. Now, in the case of a laptop or a desktop, if you're installing a desktop environment, the live image will set up sudo for you. So that way, when you want to run commands as root, for example, you'll use sudo basically just like you would in Ubuntu. And you're not going to have a root password. Now, with a net install image, it will ask you for the root password. It will not set up sudo for you, even if you do install a desktop environment. But what's even more interesting is that if you were to use the net install image to set up your system, even though, let's just say you do set up a desktop environment or you make that selection and choose to have one of them or more of them installed, you're also not going to see the boot splash either. So depending on which installer you go with, the Debian install that you end up with is going to be slightly different and a little inconsistent, which I find to be a little strange. Now, in the case of the live image, what I thought was very interesting and something that I think is very awesome is that they went with the Calamares installer. For those of you that don't know, it's an open source installer. It's not distribution specific. So if you go to install Debian Live, you might actually recognize the installer from other distributions. No, it's not your imagination. It actually is the same installer. And I think that's great that the Debian developers went that direction with the live media, because that means that they're not wasting their time reinventing the wheel, creating a brand new installer. They're using something that, has basically been proven and has been used, because I think just reinventing the installer would be a waste of the developer's time. So I'm glad to see that they went that direction. But I do think the inconsistency between the two installers is a concern. There may even be other inconsistencies between the two that I didn't even notice. Back here on my laptop, like I mentioned, this is GNOME, and this is GNOME 3.30. And you'll notice the theme here is actually the new theme from the newer version of GNOME. We're up to 3.32 at this point. This confused me at first, and what I found was that the new theme is actually part of GTK, not GNOME. So even though we have the GNOME release before the GNOME developers refined the theme, we still get the new theme. So this might actually look slightly different than another distribution shipping the same version of GNOME. But it's important to note at this time that we are one version behind on GNOME. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. But I'm not going to go over the GNOME desktop environment in too much detail. If you've seen any of my other videos about GNOME in general, you basically know what to expect here. They didn't customize very much. Like I said, other than the wallpaper, they're giving you GNOME exactly as the developers intended. GNOME software is a very basic application for installing software. And if you've used this on Fedora, it probably looks nearly identical, I'm assuming, but it gives you an option to look through all the packages that are installed here. So if you want to go ahead and remove any of these, you can. Some of these I installed myself, like for example, Frozen Bubble. I went ahead and installed that. Now I'm going to remove it. Honestly, you should have Frozen Bubble because it's a really awesome game. But I'll just give you an example here. I'll go ahead and remove that. And then I'll put in my super secret password. And you can see what it looks like to remove. So you see that it's removing it and it's gone. It kind of went away fast there. And if you want to install something new, you just go ahead and go to the category And you can see under games we have a lot. Chromium BSU is an awesome game, one of my favorites. I'll go ahead and install that so you can see the process. Pretty easy. All right, you can see that actually went pretty quickly. Anyway, we can see Chromium BSU is installed. I'm going to mute the audio here. I'll just go ahead and launch that. Very, very old school. This game has existed for my entire Linux career and has changed very, very little since then. So a little retro, but it's awesome. But anyway, that's just to show you what it's like to install applications. And then of course, we actually have an updates tab. Debian 10 just came out, so there's not going to be any updates yet. I just recently installed this anyway, so even if updates did get released afterwards, it's a fresh install, so of course I'm going to have the latest everything anyway. But that's GNOME software, and I'm not going to spend too much time on GNOME. I mean, again, if you've seen any of my previous videos on GNOME, you know what to expect. We have our workspaces here on the right. We have some applications here that are saved as favorites on the left. We can see all applications by clicking here. And then going here to all, we can see everything that we have installed and scroll through the list, and you get the idea. For the email client, we have Evolution. For some reason, I hear that's good for people out there that use Exchange, which I don't use that, so I wouldn't know. I've always gravitated toward Thunderbird, but it's easy to install. Rhythmbox for managing our music collection. LibreOffice is installed by default as well, which is at least one version behind, if I'm not mistaken. I know I mentioned GNOME was a version behind. Now I'm mentioning LibreOffice is a version behind. You're going to notice a little theme here that I'm going to get into, but it's still recent enough, I guess. And it's a really awesome Office suite. I've written all 4 of my books with it. So anytime someone tells me that LibreOffice isn't good enough to get actual work done, well, I mean, go on Amazon, you'll see my books are listed there and you can judge the end result for yourself. So now what I'm going to do is log out. And now I'm here at the login screen. This is going to look a little different for me than it would for you if you went with GNOME, because during the net install process, I actually chose to go with LightDM, which in my experience kind of works a little bit better with multiple desktop environments. But to be fair, any of the login managers will work. So I'm going to go up here to the upper right. And you can see some of the desktop environments that I went ahead and installed. I scroll down here to Cinnamon. And then I'll put in my login info here. So here we have Cinnamon. I didn't make too many changes, if any, so you're basically seeing how the Cinnamon desktop is presented in Debian 10. And I have to say, I really do like the Cinnamon environment. It just feels really responsive. I like the way it's laid out. It looks very modern. The theme even looks better than GNOME in my opinion, although I would argue the icon theme is kind of bland here. But it does work, and I have to say, it almost seems like Debian offering Cinnamon as an option kind of makes the Debian edition of Linux Mint a little useless, in my opinion. No offense to the developers of that project, but there just doesn't seem to be a whole lot of development on that distro. And now that Debian 10 is making Cinnamon a first-class citizen as an option in the net install, as well as providing a live image, I think that it's awesome to have that possibility. But essentially, everything you see here is going to be very standard. You just saw the application menu. And some of these applications are going to be KDE applications, for example, KSysGuard, K3B, things like that, because I installed multiple desktop environments. So you're going to be seeing more applications on my end than you would actually see if you installed only Cinnamon. But you get the idea. You have your applications menu, and then I'll go ahead and open a file manager. And this is the Nemo file manager, which, I actually like it. It's one of the best. But if you are not quite a GNOME fan, but you still want something modern, well, Cinnamon is a great option for you. So definitely something to consider. Let's check out another one. I'll go ahead and log out. I'm going to scroll down here to Mate. Let's check this out. Yet another option that is available to us. And I did customize this. I did install Plank down here, so you wouldn't normally see this menu. I was playing around with this. Actually, I've already recorded this review, and the entire video ended up being garbage. The video quality was terrible. Audio quality was terrible. Not even sure if the audio quality is fine now, but it's certainly worse than that version. So when I was going over this, I actually went ahead and customized it. But what you see other than Plank here at the bottom is essentially what you get with the Mate desktop environment, which is very useful for those of you on older computers. Or even if you're not on an older computer and maybe you just have even a fast new computer, but you just don't want to waste CPU cycles on fancy animations or fancy GUI elements. This is very simple. You get your application menu here at the upper left. For customization, we have the control center, which, of course, there's some KDE stuff in here because I did install that. But you get the idea. You can customize everything from your printer to your displays, your keyboard, your sound, anything you could want to configure, you can do so here. I also installed the Mate Tweak application here, so I'll go ahead and open that. This did not come installed with Mate when I selected that. I had to do an apt install Mate-tweak, but this one gives you some additional options that are not in the actual main settings app. So for example, I can disable icons on the desktop if I don't want that. But if I do want that, I can actually customize which icons I do see on the desktop. So we have a little bit of flexibility there. For the panel, I installed the Plank dock right here. So I have the enable dock checkbox. I can actually turn that off or turn it back on. So for you, this will be grayed out unless you actually have Plank installed. Again, it's just apt install Plank, P-L-A-N-K, but you get that option. But we can go back to the default by just selecting the GNOME 2 option here. And that's one of the benefits of the Mate Tweak app, is that it lets you save panel layouts and switch between them. So now I'm basically at the default. We have one called Fedora, for example, so I can change to that. Doesn't look much different than the original. And then I can go back to the custom one I was playing around with. And then I get the Plank menu back there. On Windows, right here, we can customize some window management settings. Like, for example, we can put the window controls on the left. So if you're coming from a Mac, maybe you like that better. And high DPI is probably best to leave that on auto detect. Marco Adaptive Compositor is probably a good safe default, but if you have a GPU, a dedicated GPU, maybe you'll get some extra performance if you select this option. But I'll leave that up to you to experiment with that. But that's essentially the Mate desktop environment. Now, what I did is I installed Synaptic. This doesn't normally come with the system. I just find that it's a great application to use if you wanted a GUI package manager application. It's a classic. This thing is old. It's changed very little, if any, over the years, but it works, so it doesn't need to change. So if you're not a fan of GNOME software, you can install Synaptic, just apt install Synaptic, all in lowercase. That's how it's spelled right there. And then you get this application. You can go through your different categories, and then you can install whatever you'd like. So maybe this might be something that you'd be into if you're not a fan of GNOME software. With Mate, I find that this actually works very well. So let's go ahead and check out something else here. I'm going to log out. And it's Plasma time. A lot of people on my YouTube channel are a fan of this, and there's a lot of Plasma fans out there. So definitely want to make sure I spend at least a minute or two checking this out. Here we have, if you haven't seen Plasma before, I have other videos on this, so I'm not going to go over in too much detail. We have our application menu here on the left. Of course, we can go through our application listing. We can see things related to the computer like local file system, folders. If we had something mounted like a flash drive, we could do that. We have a history here, so you can see the shenanigans that I've been getting into, of course, Synaptic and Console, which is the terminal application. Then the last section here, we can leave, basically suspend, hibernate, log out, what have you. Now, what we can also do is add widgets, and this is one of those things that makes KDE Plasma so famous, is that you can customize pretty much everything. And one of my favorite things to do, because there's a lot of things I can add, is I love the folder view. So it defaults to the desktop folder, which, there's nothing on the desktop have no icons. But you can right click on this and you can configure it, and you can point it to whatever one you want. I'm just going to go ahead and show the home folder. That's fine. So you can see the stuff I have in my home directory. So it gives you a way to browse your file system. You can hover over a folder and click the arrow to see inside the folder. I don't actually have anything in there, but that allows you to basically browse your file system tree. So let me go ahead and change this again to give you a better example of that. I'm going to change the path to the root file system. Let's see if it'll even let me do that. It does. Oh, good. So for example, you can see I can just drill through each of my folders here, and that's awesome. I love that about KDE. You can customize quite a bit. Folder view allows you to have basically an object on the desktop that's attached to a certain folder. So any of the folders that you access on a regular basis, you can have quick access to those, and you can cycle through these folders without actually opening up a file manager window. And speaking of the file manager window, so I'll go ahead and open the file manager, which is Dolphin, which is one of the best. I really do like the Dolphin file manager. It's just very easy to use. It looks elegant. It's a fantastic piece of software in much the same way that the console app, if you use the terminal, is also a very awesome application for all your terminal junkies out there. You want to run some scripts or do some system administration commands. Well, you know what? You can do that because console is available and it's a really good application. There's just a lot of things that you can go ahead and customize as you can see as I go through these various options. You can tweak it just as you'd like, and console is a very popular option for that. So I'll go ahead and close out of these apps, and you get the idea. We have a selection of desktop environments available to us, which is fantastic. You can, like I mentioned, you could choose the live installer for the desktop environment that you prefer, or you can use the net install that'll allow you to select multiple. And I'll have a video walking you guys through the installation process for both of those on my channel. So I don't think anybody would argue with me if I made the claim that Debian is one of, if not the most important distributions to the Linux community. I mean, let's face it, there are more distributions based either directly or indirectly on Debian than any other distribution base. Ubuntu is based on Debian, and then we have distributions like Linux Mint that are based on Ubuntu, and then we have MX Linux, for example, which is based on Debian directly, and there's other alternatives out there that are also based on Debian. So I think that Debian has a huge presence, so it's actually very, very, very important. So as fantastic as Debian is, and again, it is one of my favorite distributions out there, there are some downsides that I do feel like I want to talk about here. And unfortunately, the downsides that I'm going to bring up, none of them are new. So if you've heard any of my previous Debian reviews, you're probably going to be hearing me repeating myself here. But there are some rough edges that I just don't feel like ever get addressed. And one thing that I think is a big downside is that the release model for Debian is just too archaic. We have Debian Stable, which I'm reviewing here. We also have Debian Testing and Debian Unstable. I know people that run Debian Testing and Unstable as their daily driver. They have no problem with it. But those two distributions are not considered stable for day-to-day use, whereas Debian Stable, if you're using a laptop, a desktop, or a server for production reasons, then you're going to want to run Debian Stable. But the problem is the package set is just prehistoric. There seems to be this untrue mentality that in order to have a stable distribution, you have to have old software. I don't personally agree with that. I don't think we need bleeding edge software either, because yeah, bleeding edge software that does introduce some instability, but in Debian, it's not uncommon for things to be 2 or 3 major versions behind every other distribution that's out there. So for example, we have Ubuntu, which is a stable distribution. You'll get new software, but if you use Debian on release day, your software is already old. It's one thing if your software is up to date when it comes out, and then Debian Stable, it could go on for 2 years before we get a new version. Then that's fine, but on release day, everything is 1, 2, or 3 versions behind. And in my opinion, that just doesn't make Debian an attractive choice for laptops and desktops. Now, the thing is, the obvious thing to do here is just maybe have like another repository that has, updated applications that you can install. Wouldn't that be nice? Well, there is. And it's called Debian Backports. So what's cool about Debian Backports is that it's an extra repository that you can add that gives you the ability to install newer applications that aren't normally available for the current version of Debian. And while I think that's a great idea, you can't rely on it. We don't even know what to expect out of Debian Backports. I find it to be very hit or miss. Sometimes it'll be full of very useful things. Sometimes, there's really not much there. Sometimes you'll get a newer kernel. This one ships with kernel 4.19, and that's okay. It's actually pretty old, but normally you can use like the Backports repository to get a newer kernel. But even after Debian Backports is released, we don't know when we're going to get a new kernel. And not having the option for a newer kernel is kind of egregious because you're going to be missing out on some features that maybe you want to take advantage of. An example of that is AMD FreeSync support for all you gamers out there. That was introduced in kernel 5. We're on kernel 4.19 on release day. So using a 4x kernel on a brand new release in July of 2019 is kind of strange when all the other distributions out there have all switched to Linux 5. We're still on Linux 4 on Debian, which just kind of feels strange at this point. I do understand that the Debian project, they basically stick to the LTS kernels, and to be fair, kernel 4.19 is the latest LTS kernel. But the LTS kernel is not going to work for everyone. So I think that's something to take note of if you're a gamer, or if there's more modern features you want to take advantage of. Everything in Debian, including the kernel, is old as of the release day. Another quirk that I find a little annoying is the fact that the only option you really have in terms of the Firefox browser is Firefox ESR. The Firefox ESR version is actually for those of you that don't want your browser to change. It's especially important in corporate environments. Maybe you want to have a stable browser that doesn't change much. You don't want to basically update Firefox every month and a half or however long it updates. I get it. There is a use case for that. But for 90% of you, I bet you want to be on the latest Firefox, but you can't just apt-get install Firefox. It's not available. They just decide that nobody needs it. The Debian developers just don't package it. So it's almost like they're saying nobody needs anything but Firefox ESR. Actually, we want the normal Firefox. A lot of people do. And there is a way to install the Quantum version of Firefox, current Firefox. And I'll have a video up on my channel that shows you that process, but it's not going to be a matter of apt install Firefox. It's just not available in the package repository. So, that's something to take into consideration. But then again, if you are a fan of Google Chrome, for example, maybe that's the direction that you're going to gravitate toward anyway. And the other complaint that I have about Debian, and again, this is the same complaint that I've always had, is that the hardware support in Debian Stable is terrible. It's the only distribution that I know of on release day will most likely not work with a lot of laptops and desktops that are current. So if you go to like a store and buy a laptop, the newest model, the newest hardware, chances are Debian Stable will not work because the laptop is actually newer, or the hardware on the laptop is newer than the Debian release because they basically froze everything 6 months ago and they'll never update the hardware enablement stack. There is no hardware enablement stack. All the drivers you get, that's it. So if it doesn't work with your hardware, chances are it never will until the next version of Debian. And some people will actually run Debian testing for this very reason because they actually want more modern drivers and packages and software. But Debian testing is not considered stable. You can experience packages that are effectively broken. The repository might be down, or it might have some missing dependencies. There's some rough edges in testing. There's a reason why they don't recommend that to be your daily driver. Again, I know a lot of people do this, but they're people that understand these types of things and are not frustrated by random missing dependencies or repository sync issues and things like that. But the problem I experience myself is I tried to install Debian 10 on my X1 Extreme, which is not the newest version. I don't remember if the new one is out yet, but it's about to be out. But Debian 10 will not boot on it. I mean, I made sure secure boot is disabled, for example, there's just no possibility of booting Debian 10 on that laptop. It works fine on this one, but what's interesting is that Ubuntu has no problem on that laptop. So why wouldn't Debian work? I mean, yes, Debian and Ubuntu are two different distributions, but they do get their packages, or at least most of them, from the same source. So you would think that Debian shouldn't have any problem on that, but it doesn't work. As of release day, I cannot get that installed. I did Google around looking for a solution. I didn't find one. I know that there is a workaround, but I just had to basically record this video and get this done. But I did spend some time trying to fix it. I wasn't able to. So what I find is that Ubuntu is way better when it comes to hardware support. Debian, for example, they will withhold the wireless drivers, for example, anything proprietary they leave out of the ISO. If you know how to find it, you can find an ISO with non-free software included, but I just don't really feel it's appropriate for Debian to provide a lackluster user experience just to double down on their ethics of free software. And I get it. Free software is my preference as well. I think that it's an amazing thing, and I hate proprietary software, but when it becomes a matter of my Wi-Fi adapter working or not, then I'm going to use my Wi-Fi adapter. I'm going to basically want to make sure that that works. And Debian has no problem giving you a release that doesn't work with your Wi-Fi adapter, and it doesn't work with Intel cards. Intel cards are a vast majority of the Wi-Fi out there. So chances are when you install Debian, it's not going to work with your Wi-Fi. Now, I know how to work around that. You just download the non-free ISO, or you could just put the packages on a flash drive and plug it in, and that's fine. There's definitely ways around that, but a beginner is going to get frustrated and just give up because it's just not going to be a good experience for them. So, between the packages being prehistoric, hardware support not being there, missing packages, your Wi-Fi drivers will not be there unless you know what version to use. It's hard for me to recommend Debian for the average person. If you're an intermediate or advanced user, Debian is awesome. Debian Stable is just as the name implies. It's stable, and I do love this distribution. I know I'm talking very negatively about it, but I have to call it like I see it. Unless you have a very specific reason, I do recommend you use Ubuntu instead. For example, the LTS versions of Ubuntu, they regularly update the hardware enablement stack to make sure that it works with newer computers. So, you can use 1804, which came out last year, and download it today, and it has a very good chance of working with brand new hardware, whereas with Debian 10 on release day will not work with a lot of modern hardware. So I think that's a big difference between the two. But on the positive side of things, I love the way that Debian allows you to very easily have multiple desktop environments. You get a choice of 2 different installers depending on what your purpose is. There's an installer for that. So you get a lot of options. And then, this is probably the biggest benefit, now we're going to have distributions coming out based on Debian 10 that might even clean up some of those rough edges. That's one of the reasons why MX Linux is so awesome, because it actually makes Debian all that much better. They just take care of some of those things that some users might struggle with. So that's not to say that there's no benefit here. Debian is a great distribution. I know I'm being very hard on it, but I would challenge the Debian developers with Debian 11 to address some of these issues. Maybe we could have an intermediary repository that includes newer stuff, or even just have Debian backports. Some actual real developer attention put on that to make sure that it's available with all the backported drivers that we might need for newer hardware. That would be awesome. We don't really need to do much to make Debian great. We just have a few rough edges to clean up and it would be perfect. But I hope that it gets there. So what are your opinions of Debian 10? Let me know in the comments below, and I look forward to reading that. And in the meantime, I'm going to get back to recording some additional tutorials for you guys. So I am excited for those, and stay tuned, and you should see those coming up here pretty soon. Thank you so much for watching my video. I really appreciate it. If you want to help me out, make sure you check out the description below this video, where you'll find links to my latest book, Mastering Ubuntu Server 2nd edition, as well as my Patreon page. If you like this video, be sure to click that like button and share it on Twitter or any other social media network. And be sure to subscribe so you'll be the first to see my latest videos as they're uploaded. Thanks again.